Yeah, one of the things that I did want to pick up on, having sent you some questions, is actually something that I think precedes that. And I hadn't realised until I reread it that the relationship marketing book did make the point about competition not being between companies, but between their networks, alliances, or supply chains. And I think that's been much more the focus of your work subsequently.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So I don't know if it's possible to explain fairly straightforwardly some of the implications of that. When I explain that statement to people, intuitively, I think they get it, particularly as charities who've always worked in partnership. But I think there must be a number of implications that come out of just that observation.
Yeah. Well, I think the main implication is because, when I've often in the classroom or wherever, or talking to executive workshops, said we compete as supply chains or as supply networks. And people say, well, how can that be? Because we don't necessarily have a unique set of supply arrangements. If I'm Ford competing with General Motors, they actually share quite a few first tier and second tier suppliers. So it's not as if they have a unique supply chain. But what is unique is the quality of the relationships they have with those suppliers. And I think this is what makes the difference, basically. Because particularly a lot of innovation these days is supplier driven anyway. And so
you'll have to tell me more about that in a moment. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it's the old school of purchasing and procurement, which is where you hold your suppliers at arm's length. You play one off against the other. What you miss out on is the fact that there's a lot of knowledge there. There's a lot of capability often. There's a lot of innovation in many cases, R&D and so forth. And being able to access that, but also too, of course, being able to work in a integrated manner, in which it means that we can eliminate buffers of inventories, because we've got processes that are closely linked together. So as you know, the Japanese, of course, were the first to introduce just in time and all that sort of stuff. And that's all part and parcel of how we've brought the suppliers into our enterprise. It's not as if they're separate, they're part of it almost.
You mentioned supplier-led innovation and procurement, which I know you've done a lot of work on procurement. That's a massive issue, perhaps surprisingly to a layperson, but it's a massive issue for the charity sector, where particularly the larger charities no longer thrive on donations and event fundraising, but they have public sector supply contracts that are procured through competitive tendering processes. And I think that world is shifting to being more relationship-based and a wee bit more recognition of supplier-led innovation, but I think can still feel adversarial and playing off different suppliers. So has that been a shift that's been taking place within procurement more broadly?
I think so. I mean, if you look at the I'm thinking about the regular magazine that comes from the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, CIPS. So many of the case studies in there are very much about what we might call partnership sourcing, and very much about how it's in everybody's interests that we actually work in a way which is win-win, because we don't actually want to work with unprofitable suppliers, because basically there isn't going to be much of a future for that. And I think we're now looking at in fact, the very fact that CIPS, which the initials used to stand for Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, and they changed it to Procurement and Supply, because procurement is a more strategic sort of role. It's very much about identifying who we want to partner with and how we want that partnership to work. Whereas, purchasing was basically about doing a deal.
It's transactional.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. So I think that across the industry as a whole, certainly if we look at the sort of more established side of business, that this different view of procurement is really taken center stage. And one reason for it, of course, is that we're now having to recognize that we have far greater dependencies on outside organizations than we did before. For many organizations, we've changed from a world where we used to do most things in-house to where we've now outsourced, well, in some cases, pretty well everything. And so the chief procurement officer now is actually one of the most important people in that organization, because in effect, they're responsible now for orchestrating that network.
Somebody's that network of strategic relationships.
Somebody's got to be in that driving seat, managing those relationships. And so things like supplier relationship management is now much more a sort of key part of the role of procurement. We never even used to talk about it 20 years ago. So I think that's a significant change that's now being quite widely acknowledged. But the great danger, as we've come to recognize in many cases, is that often companies haven't realized that whilst you can outsource the execution of an activity, you should never outsource its control. And I think it's this idea of remaining in the driving seat that's so crucial. And if we look at a lot of government procurement, for instance, the reason it's gone so badly wrong is, well, first of all, they probably lack, and they would disagree with this, but they probably lack that sort of professional capability. But they've actually just left it to these third-party organizations just to get on and do it. You go ahead and build this hospital for me. You go ahead and, build this app for COVID testing, and just get on with it. And it doesn't always work, as we well know. And I think it's this much more hands-on, and this again is what typifies, I think, the sort of successful, sophisticated professional procurement executives, that they recognize they've got to be much more engaged with those suppliers. You can't just hand it over to them.
And there's a spectrum almost then, because there's the giving people the space and expecting the innovation there that can come from that. And then there's maybe over specifying something that you're not technically proficient in. And it's how you get the balance between the space and the specification. So it sounds like, again, you're back to the quality of those relationships.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because rather than talk about outsourcing, I mean, in the ideal world, you'd talk about insourcing, because what you'd want to do is you want to bring a strength that you don't have into your business, basically. Okay, you don't want to own that company. You don't want those people on your payroll necessarily. But you want to work with them as if they were a part of that, of your business. And so I think it's, as you say, it's a balance. It's recognizing that these people are the specialists. That's why we're using them. But I want them to be as integrated as possible into my whole business operation, basically.
And I love that expression that you used, treating them as if they were part of the company. I think, sorry.
I know, I was going to say, sometimes we call this the extended enterprise, that it's not, it's as if it were a single business, but it's not, obviously.
And that's exactly the point I was going to make, was I think sometimes organizations think that they're shaped like this, and actually they're shaped like that. They have much more permeable boundaries than they might realize. And again, that's why so many of the core realizations I had from the relationship marketing ideas and theories and practice were a revelation, because if I was looking to help my charity or company survive, almost instinctively as human beings, it seems that we circle the wagons and we draw in, and sustainable competitive advantage might look like when you're at school and you don't want other people to see your exam paper, and not just in the charity world. I think broadly there's an acceptance now sustainable competitive advantage is the complete opposite, is opening your arms, isn't it?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting point that more and more companies are starting to adopt, that it's this notion that says, because of the sort of growing complexity of the technologies, of the sort of markets and the channels, we can't possibly do all that ourselves. We don't have that capability. And so this willingness to even to share sometimes with competitors, It's very interesting that I guess it began in the sort of consumer world, but what some people now call the sharing economy, which says, well, do you really want to own things? If you're only going to use it part of the time, why not? It may cost you more, but actually it costs you less probably, and it's also much more flexible. So a lot of procurement now is actually about structuring those sorts of deals. And those arrangements, which could sometimes even be with competitors, about sharing facilities. Shared distribution, for instance, has been around for a long time. You'll often have competitors. I recall when Colgate, Palmolive, and Unilever shared the same warehouse, for instance, in the UK, even though they compete on the shelf. But they've taken the view that, well, we don't compete in the warehouse, or we don't compete on the road in a truck. We compete on the shelf. So where it makes sense, if we can share an asset, let's do it. And that, I think, again, is sort of indicative of this sort of changed mindset that we're seeing now to how we work with other players in the network.
Mm. That's interesting, and I'm trying to, as you're speaking, trying to relate that to real life examples that I would know about, which are they're with charities, and they're with organisations who don't have a lot of tangible resources coming into their organisations, but straight away I can think of examples where it's really hard at the moment to recruit staff into the social care field. People's wages have been driven down by competitive tendering, such that it's hard to compete with supermarkets, for instance, which would on the face of it be much easier work. And so what some service providers have begun to do is to come together to take part and responsibility for the training and putting on joint training for people, or to address collectively issues with recruitment to try and make the market more attractive to entrants. So that's an example, I think, of where our main supply might not be a physical, tangible product, but is essentially a human resource or knowledge. And in the six markets model I'd mentioned to you, I'd made an adaptation, I thought, until I looked back on the book and I saw that in there you don't just focus on the supply market, but the alliance market. I wonder if you can tell us a wee bit more about that, about the supply of, I guess, knowledge or the intelligence that comes from alliances and partnerships, as opposed to the tangible supply chain.
Yeah, well, I think it applies in every business, to be honest. We've always thought, because most of the early work was done in manufacturing and so on. That's why I think a lot of the examples and case studies relate to that. But it actually extends right across the board. So a lot of work was done some years back, actually beginning at Harvard, on what they call the service chain. And effectively, what it was highlighting was that the successful companies, particularly those in customer-facing, service-oriented sectors, and it's pretty obvious, it's not rocket science, those successful companies are the ones where they've engaged highly motivated people to work for them, who are who live the brand, so to speak, and who deliver above average service. And well, I guess we don't need to do a PhD to know that, but that's actually demonstrated time and time again. And yet so many companies fail to recognize this. I always remember reading somewhere, it was about I think the founder of Marriott hotel chains, and when he was interviewing potential managers for these hotels, he'd say to them, he said, look, I've got three groups of people that I've got to think about. I've got customers, I've got my shareholders, I've got my employees. And he said to the potential manager, he said, where do you think I should put my priority? And of course, the guys would think about this and say, is this a trick question or what? And they say, well, it's obviously got to be the customer, hasn't it? We've got to give the customer the priority. So they say, yeah, we give the priority to the customer. And Bill Marriott would say, well, actually, no, I put the priority with the employees. Because if I've got the right employees and they're happy employees, they're employees, they're motivated, they're going to deliver above average service. The experience will be great. People will want to come back. That will make my shareholders happy. So this is the service profit chain, we call it. Again, it's pretty basic stuff,
but easily overlooked.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the one of the things that intrigued me when I went back to the book, which I hadn't picked up on first time, but has actually become very important now subsequently, is there's a taxonomy in there of high value, high cost clients. You have a taxonomy of the value versus the cost of maintaining those contracts. And I think when it comes to charity survival and sustainability, people are often not business-like enough about recognizing that some customers are worth more than others, some cost more than others. And it would be interesting to just get your reflections on how those customers are identified, the high value, high cost ones, and how they can be managed.
Yeah, well, it's again, it's an idea that isn't new, but it's not often implemented, and that is that we don't understand what we sometimes call a cost to serve. We know how much revenue we get from each customer, each segment, or each market that we serve. That's pretty easy to keep track of. But what is a lot harder to understand is the fact that every customer has a unique profile in terms of what it actually costs us to serve them. So, for instance, with major accounts, we may have a key account manager or a key account team even. If we're selling into retail, we might even employ merchandisers. These are people who go and put the stuff on the shelf in the retail outlet. It may be that this retailer demands a particular shelf-ready pack, which is tailored to meet their particular needs. So again, there's a lot of additional manufacturing cost engaged. A lot of these costs are not easy to pinpoint. So we often find that the customers who you think are the most critical to you, they may be in terms of volume, but you might actually be losing money in some cases. And this, I think, is where increasingly, certainly if we're looking at logistics today, we're getting much more concerned about what we call the cost to serve, because these costs, you've heard of people talk about the last mile costs and so on. This is where so much cost is it doesn't matter which market we're talking about. And so it requires a much higher level of sophistication using tools like activity-based costing, being able to recognize our systems that we've used in the past are based upon, if you remember from your MBA, when you did accounting, it was about full cost accounting, where you allocate overheads and you get all sorts of distortion because of the method of allocation. So it's really changing the way we look at cost. And the way I like to advocate is what I call avoidable costs, which says, look, if I didn't serve this particular customer, which costs would you avoid? Because those are the only real costs that matter, basically. And in some cases, you end up saying, well, actually, I won't necessarily avoid many costs because I'll still have the factory. I'll still be sending a truck out. So, yeah, it's really the traditional tools that we've used for 100 or more years don't actually help us very much in understanding the difference between, a profitable customer and a less profitable one.
I love the idea of avoidable costs. How does that go down? Because I'm just thinking of if I were to try and introduce that to an organization, for instance, that sees, I don't know, for example, 40% of its revenue might come from one high volume, high cost maintenance contract with maybe quite a demanding public service commissioner, for instance. The avoidable costs would probably be psychological. The effort of maintaining maybe a difficult relationship, for instance, that there might be overheads, but very often there'll be staffing that have been brought in to service that. So there will be a lot of avoidable direct costs, but the avoidable costs, I suppose, are the indirect ones. And like I say, probably the effort of maintaining a relationship. It'd be interesting to see how other people have responded to that idea when you introduce it to them.
Yeah, well, I think it's one that it's an easy idea, but it's people are sort of reluctant to adopt it because it sort of challenges so much of our conventional sort of way of doing things, basically.
And revenue, because I think the in terms of the traditional way of thinking, I think if I were to introduce that question to people about avoidable costs, they would, I think, almost always automatically go back to, but look at the lost revenue, even if that revenue is costing them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So these are challenging questions for any organization, basically, and they tend not to ask those questions, really. Just carry on as they've always done.
Yes, and I think people understand that not all money is good money. I think that's become people have become a bit more intelligent about that, and that not all customers are necessarily the right customer. When people want to understand why I'm so turned on by the relationship marketing concepts and they're looking for a way to pin it down, I sometimes glibly paraphrase it as do good work and the money will follow.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's simplistic, it's probably oversimplified, but it's that principle of if we put the money first, we lose our way. So focus on doing the good work and the money will follow.
That's right. Well, I think that, if you want to expand what we mean by doing good work, basically what it's about is delivering value and an experience. By value, I don't mean value for money. When marketing people, it's that value proposition idea, right? That there's a compelling reason, and we're actually doing something which, well, today again, marketing people like to talk about customer experience. Basically, it's all part and parcel of recognizing that we're no longer selling products, we're selling outcomes, and so doing good work in your terminology would mean that we're delivering an outcome which is valued by that customer, and is seen as actually delivering more than they would get for the equivalent cost or the equivalent effort, whatever it may be, somewhere else. So that's the compelling reason.
And that's so interesting. It's maybe a rabbit hole that we don't want to go down, but so interesting to hear you describing companies selling outcomes, because I think that's often, in terms of like the traditional transformation model, that's, I think, something that distinguishes charities is they not only have to sell the outcome, but they have to measure the outcome. Whereas a car company can sell me a Volkswagen on the basis of it'll give me freedom or kudos or whatever, but they don't have to measure that freedom or kudos. But the feedback loop for charities goes as far as from the output to the outcome, and really being funded on that basis. Like I say, possibly a rabbit hole for just now, but it's interesting that there's a shift even now for other types of private sector organisations to be focusing much more on that customer experience outcome. That's really interesting.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've covered the points I was hoping to add more, actually, and it's been just as interesting as I hoped it would be, and I hope that other people watching this have the same experience.